Welcome to your online lab meeting. So let's get started with this. Sorry the recorded video didn't work the other day in class, so we are going to do another screen capture. So a quick outline for today. We're going to review finding scales really quickly. We've talked about that before, so we won't take too much time with that. The main point today I want to talk about is creating scales. So I'll give you some pitfalls to avoid, some tips on things to do to make a good scale so that you can have scales to use in your paper and in the class survey so that we have some data that is of interest to you and you can discuss in your paper. All right, then we'll do the reliability and validity worksheet, which is your lab assignment 4. And then with any extra time you have after that for the normal amount of time lab takes, I'd suggest working on your annotated bibliography, finding scales, maybe study for the exam, or spend time creating a scale after you learn about some good tips for creating a scale. All right, so first, about finding scales. So here are a couple variables you might be interested in relation to child or adult attachment. A lot of people have talked about being interested in looking at divorce's effects, parent discipline, child temperament, parent temperament. So there's a lot of different variables you might be interested in. And so you're doing these annotated bibliographies, you're combining all these materials, you're thinking about how they connect, and you're going to write about that in a paper. But with that, you're also trying to make hypotheses about how these things are related. So divorce, for example, is your hypothesis that a child who is in a family with divorced parents, is that child going to be more or less attached to the parent they stay with after the divorce? So that is your hypothesis, and that might be the questions you ask on the survey. And so this is the thing, you're connecting all these pieces together. You've got this literature review where you've reviewed the journal articles, the literature, you've written your annotated bibliographies. So you have a background in this material that you've combined and collected, and you go and you make a scale or find a scale and you actually collect data on it yourself after making these hypotheses, and then we talk about it in the results and discussion. So if you don't have to get a scale for the class, it's not a requirement, but it will make your paper much better, because if you don't get a scale, well, you might have someone else in the class who got one that will work for your paper. But if you don't have a scale, if you don't have data to collect on your own topic, then in the results and discussion section, you might not have much to talk about. You might talk about how child attachment looked in relation to other unrelated variables, or just how many people were securely attached. So it will make your paper much better if you do find a scale or you do create one. So please take some time to use one of those for your annotated bibliography, find a scale. So let's talk about that. So searching for articles and scales. So I've again put the link up here to the library resource for CAS students, where you can get to all the databases like PsycInfo, using EBSCO and ERIC and whatnot. So you can click that top link for that, or this bottom link for Google Scholar. And right now in my hotel room, the internet is not working very well, which is why this recording is delayed. So I apologize for that, but I was going to look for some examples of these, but I decided I just needed to use articles I currently had. So let's say you have an article in your annotated bibliography, you've saved this article, you remember it talked about the topics you're interested in. So let's go to that article that we have saved, and it's Men and Women's Attachment and Contact Patterns with Parents During the First Year of College. So we are talking to college students, so this might be really related. And so maybe we're thinking about how is this attachment related to contact with parents. So maybe there's some measures that we would be interested in. So this is already an article that's, for example, in your annotated bibliography. Maybe you need to review the abstract really quickly, but really the thing you should do after seeing that maybe this is the topic you want to be looking at is scroll down to the methods section. So look for the measures section and see what kinds of measures they used. So it looks like they used an inventory of parent and peer attachment. So if that's what you want to use, obviously we don't need to use a attachment measure, we've already got that covered. We're using the adult attachment measure. But maybe this is what you need, for example. So you're looking for the scales and looking for what you need, what you want to assess. So here, let's imagine we do need this inventory of parent and peer attachment. You say, okay, the quality of attachment and perceived by each student was measured by this instrument. So the IPPA by Armstrong and Greenberg. All right, so you say, okay, that looks like a scale I would want to use. So you go down here to the reference list, IPPA Greenberg. So let's look for that. Or was there another name before that? Was Greenberg the second author? Let's scroll back up and double check. Armstrong and Greenberg. All right, so let's look for Armstrong. All right, it looks like it's this one, this inventory of parents and peer attachment. So what we would do is we would copy that, and we'd go to Google Scholar, we'd search for that actual article so that we could see if that actual article contains the scale, contains the measure. And if it does, awesome, we have that measure, that's what we can use. If it doesn't, if it wants to make you pay for it, or if it wants you to register for it or email the researcher for it, just skip it, just don't worry about it. Another thing you can look at if, say, you can't find the actual scale is a lot of times there might be example questions. Doesn't look like this one has any example questions. It talks to you about the validity of the measure. Or maybe this is need-based contact patterns. So here's some example questions. So it doesn't give you a reference to the scale because they constructed these scales. So let's say you were looking for a scale of contact patterns between parents or peers. This gives you the way to assess it using a Likert scale, and it gives you the example questions. How often do you contact your parents when you need something from them? And it would be not very often to very often or something like that. You'd have to read in more detail. How often do you contact your parents when you need their help? How often do you contact your parents to touch base when there's nothing particular, when there's no particular reason? So it gives you these example questions. You can use those for your scale, even though you might not have the whole scale. You can use the options they give you and then maybe write some yourself. So those are two ways to find a good scale, is looking for the citations, the scales that they used, looking for the example questions that they include in the measures. So that is how to find a scale. If you're just going to search for it, I have some tips for you. So if you just go to Google Scholar or PsycInfo or ERIC to search for it, some tips is search for the thing you want. Maybe it's parent temperament, and then use measure or scale. So search parent temperament measure and see if anything pops up, or parent temperament scale and see if anything pops up. So we just talked about this second point. So find the article that is about the topic and see how they measured it. If they used a survey measure like a scale, you can use that as well if you can find it. So it takes a little bit of work to go and hunt it down, but it's not that hard to do. It may take a little bit of time, and if it's taking too much time, maybe you'll just want to create it. But yeah, find the full citation of the article and search for the original article. Make sure if it's not in the text like that, sometimes the actual measure will be in a table in the appendix, so after all the references, or it might be within the paper in tables within the paper. So look for it in multiple places. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is creating scales. And so this is a big important part of what you might be doing, because it might be too hard for you to find a good scale, or you might not know where to find it, or you have some specific questions that you want to ask. So let's talk about creating scales. So the first thing I want to talk to you about in regards to creating scales is to think about the response set you're using. So one thing that I want to encourage you to use is a response set like this. A Likert scale that's on 7 points from 1 strongly disagree to 7 strongly agree. So if you're writing a scale, try to write it so that that's the response set. When all the scales have the same response set, it makes it easier and quicker for participants to go through. They're less tired, it's less confusing, so they'll do better and they can do more surveys, like more scales in a survey in the same amount of time when they're all the same. And that's pretty easy. Everybody's seen this before. It's understandable to them. So, but another point with that is here's 2 different response sets. So an experiment was done and the only thing that was different was the response set. So group A, which was randomly assigned or selected, got this version A response set. They were asked about their TV watching and studying. So with both TV, they were asked, how much TV do you watch? Less than half an hour, up to or more than 2.5 hours. So that was what they were asked. And then also the same with studying. And then another group, they were asked, how much TV do you watch? And so they were asked either less than 2.5 hours to more than 4.5 hours. So let's see what only that change did in the reports of studying and TV. So here on the left, we see the group that had the low version, so 2.5 hours and above was the max, and this version had the high scale. So people who had the high scale were 3 times more likely to say they had studied 2.5 hours or more, and also double as likely to say that they watched TV 2.5 hours or more. So that just goes to show you that using the response set that you choose is going to affect the kind of data that you get. The reality of this is it's probably somewhere in the middle for all these people, but people don't like to put the extreme ends of a scale. So people will say, oh, 2.5 hours is the top measure here. That's the very top one. So maybe that's bad if I'm actually watching 2.5 hours. So I'm going to say I watch between 2 and 2.25 versus this person, they said, oh, less than 2.5 hours? Well, I think I actually do watch 2 hours of TV a day only. But since that seems maybe it's unusual because it's the bottom one, maybe they'll put this one. And so you're giving measurement error. You're not getting at the true score because of your response set. So like I said, I'd like you to try as best you can as to create items that use this response set because it's understandable, it's quick and easy for people to do, and yes, it still has the problem people don't like to select strongly disagree and people don't like to select strongly agree, but there's enough variance here. We've got another 5 points here and then these 7 points when people do use those 2 ends to give us enough variance to look at some correlations and things like that. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is the life bar. So you see here you've got a life bar of the character Link from Legend of Zelda. And the reason I put this here, one, because I wanted to put a picture of Legend of Zelda in a presentation that I was doing, so I did. But the main reason I actually did it is because Link in this example is our participant who is taking our survey. And so anything that happens in the survey that they don't like, maybe that's reactive, any kind of reactivity. If the second question is about the gender of the person and they don't identify as male and female, but you don't have an other selection where they can enter in what they identify as, that might make them upset, and now their life bar might have been full but now it's half full, for example. Or maybe it's just little things over the course of the time. Maybe there's some misspellings in one scale, so that cuts down 1 heart. Maybe the next scale that they take, maybe they didn't understand the question. It was too complicated, so that takes down another heart. So think about the attention, the interest, the motivation of the people taking the scale. Try to make it as simple as possible and as straightforward as possible, even energizing. You can do things to make them feel better. For example, in some surveys I do with high school students, halfway through I'll put a picture of a cat and just be like, hey, this is to re-energize you. And as you sit there watching the class take the survey, suddenly you'll see people smile and be a little happier for the rest of the scale, and they'll actually be more motivated to do it because they're like, oh, these guys aren't so bad. That's a funny picture. So think about the life bar as you are creating your scale, and here are a couple specific things to look for. So avoid double-barreled questions because they confuse people, they take a little more energy, they take a little bit of that life bar away. So an example is, how many days have you worked this season when you were injured or ill? So that might be confusing for someone because what if they were injured but not ill? What if they were injured and ill at the same time? Do they double it? They were injured one day and ill 2 days. So that just might be a little confusing. Maybe this next one is a better example. So does your job require you to do repetitive lifting, pushing, pulling, or bending? So what if your job requires lifting, pushing, pulling, but not bending? What do you put? What do you respond to there? That might be difficult for someone. They might not know what to put. So you're going to add some measurement error into your scale. And we don't want that measurement error. All right, so another point is to choose simple rather than specialized or technical words. So here's an example that was actually in a survey. I think this was a survey actually by one of my professors. Contamination of drink. How much do you worry about contamination of drinking water from hydroelectric? If I read that in the survey, I don't think I would understand what it's talking about. I mean, after talking in class about this, I think that it's talking about hydroelectric power. So your water went through a hydroelectric power plant, or maybe it's a hydroelectric processing of some sort. But in any case, I don't understand what it's talking about. So maybe if it had used more simple words, it might have been made more sense. So here's some clear examples. Use the words tired, honest, most important, free time, instead of the words on the right. Even though things like brave and courageous, most people will get, some of the people who are taking your measure might not have the same literacy level as you do. We forget that as college students, we are used to reading quite frequently. You're reading chapters and chapters every week in books. A lot of people aren't doing that, so they're not going to be as familiar with some vocabulary words, for example. So you want to make it easy for them. And even if they are familiar with other words, making it easy for them keeps their life bar up. So choose as few words as possible to pose a question. So for example, this question says the working environment is sufficiently enlightened. You can delete sufficiently and it asks the same thing. And it takes just a little less time, keeps the life bar up. So use as few words as possible. And avoid negatively worded items. These are confusing for people sometimes. People don't like looking at negatively worded items. So an example is, I used to set goals for myself, but now that seems a waste of time. Do I disagree that now it's a waste of time? Do I disagree that I used to set a goal for myself? Sometimes it can just be a little confusing. And usually when you check the reliability of negatively worded items, you'll see that they don't actually correlate or fall in with the other items when you do the reliability test that we talked about on Tuesday. So that is the main points for creating scales. One thing that I want to talk to you about is with creating scales, if you don't know what variables you want to investigate or you can't decide what you want your paper to be about, this is really the time to narrow that down and figure that out for sure. So definitely come to me. You can either come to office hours, it's the hour before class Tuesday and Thursday, or you can email me about it. You just let me know what your struggles are with deciding on what variables or how to study these things, and I'll help you figure it out so that you can have a paper and a study and some data that is of interest to you, that's answering some sort of interesting question for you. Yes, you could just go through the whole thing with just doing some lit review and making up a paper about things that are kind of tangentially of interest to you, but if you pick some topics that are actually useful to you, this is going to be a really good experience for you. You're going to learn a lot of new skills, and that's what I'm wanting you to get out of this class, is this practice and these skills. So while the lectures are good to kind of give you an idea of things that are in the field, this practical experience is the most important part of this course. So definitely come to me and let me know what you need help with. I had some questions on Tuesday's lab about what are we going to do with our scales. So we have the adult attachment questionnaire already set out, so you don't need to worry about getting any scale of adult attachment. But let's say you're wanting to look at divorce, or maybe you're wanting to look at temperament and how it affects adult attachment. These three down here are the kinds of scales you might want to create or find. So find a scale of parent discipline, or create a scale of parent discipline. And with that, we're asking these adults about their attachment with a mother or mother figure. So if you're creating a scale of discipline, you will want to ask this adult, say, what was your mother's parenting like, essentially. So you might say, I felt, so a question, an item might be, I felt that my mother's punishments were too harsh. Strongly disagree to strongly agree. I feel that my mother's punishments did not fit the crime. Strongly disagree, strongly agree. Or, I feel like my mother's punishments were always fair. Strongly disagree to strongly agree. Or I feel that my mother's punishments did not make sense. Or a lot of these that I'm suggesting are negatively worded, so they're probably bad items. But you might ask, when my mother disciplined me, it helped me think about what I did wrong. Strongly disagree, strongly agree. So those are the kind of examples of scales. And so you will come to class, hopefully next week, with that scale that you've created or you've found. We'll put them all together, and all these scales, so you might bring a discipline scale. Your neighbor might bring a temperament scale. Someone else in the class might bring a divorce scale. We put it together with the adult attachment scale, and all these scales put together become our survey. And so in the next couple weeks after that, you will take this survey and have some of your friends do it. And then we will come back, and so every person who does the survey will have given data on all these points. So when you write your paper, when we run the data, we'll look at the correlation between parent discipline and adult attachment. We might run some other statistics. And then in your paper, you will write about only those 2 points, discipline and adult attachment, if that's what you're interested in, or divorce and adult attachment. Maybe you decide, maybe divorce and temperament is a better, more interesting thing to write about, so you write about those 2 variables. Maybe you think divorce and discipline and attachment share a nice mediating relationship, so then you look at those. So that's an example of what I'm looking for, what we're going to be doing with the survey. Everybody's doing the same survey, all the friends are doing the same survey, and then we're using that data. So, reminder, they're due next week. If you create it yourself, make it between 3 and 10 items. Now let's look at the reliability and validity worksheet for your homework, because that's the end of the lab portion of the lecture. I want to show you the worksheet really quick, give you a couple pointers on it, and then turn you loose to do that. And after you've finished with the reliability and validity worksheet, take some time to find or create a measure. Maybe do an annotated bibliography of a scale that you find. Alright, so here is your lab assignment 4. I want to go over just a couple quick things. So it pretty much contains some activities, you might call them games, to help remind you and help you work on understanding reliability and validity, different types of scales, things like that. So click on the link here and do this exercise. So this will talk about different types of scales, and so you'll match them up. With these, there is one of them, I believe it might be this first one, that asks at the end to, if you want to send an email to me or to someone with your score, don't send the email, just include your score right here. Alright, so here we've got targets that represent reliability and validity. So remember, reliability is consistency, so they're a consistent cluster of these dots. And validity is it getting at what you want it to get at? So the center of the target is what you want it to get at. So with reliability is valid, put either no, so no reliability, no validity, low reliability, low validity, or high reliability and high validity. You can actually find this exact picture in one of the previous PowerPoints. Alright, so here's another exercise about types of validity. So with that, you should be able to figure that one out on your own pretty easily. There's nothing strange with that one. This one down here, the types of variables, there is a mediating variable in there. Anxiety is the mediating variable in the relationship described here. So if we remember, mediating variables are variables where there's the independent variable, so we call it A, and then the dependent variable, which we might call C, and then there's a mediating variable that A connects to. So adult attachment or child attachment might be, or let's say maybe parent temperament mediates the relationship between child temperament and child attachment. So child attachment would be over here. So child temperament would be over here. A parent temperament would be over here, and child attachment would be over here. So there's a direct link between these two, but it also goes this way to parent temperament as well. So anxiety is the mediating variable. Other than that, you should be able to figure that one out. Here are a couple articles. So this is to help you figure out what's experimental, what's not experimental. Experiments are defined by, the key points of experiments are that it needs to be randomly assigned or randomly selected, and there needs to be a manipulation. So look at the abstracts for all these. You should be able to figure it out just from the abstracts of these 5 articles. Decide if it is an experimental or non-experimental study, and then highlight in green. Or if you're on a Mac and it doesn't want to let you highlight, then underline it, turn the words green, something like that, so I can know whether you think it's experimental or non-experimental. Alright, and then last of all, you'll have some correlation practice. So it gives you 4 example distributions of scores. So remember the axes is going up both ways. So, and it will help teach you as well as help you practice what different correlation coefficients are. So that is the assignment for today for lab. Get to it, and with any extra remaining time you have, look for or create some scales. And if you have any questions about this, feel free to let me know. This is due midnight on Thursday. Thank you, and good luck.